the censored words of Jesus. A thick fog hangs over ancient hills. The wind carries echoes of voices that have crossed centuries, words that were spoken under olive trees and on the shores of calm lakes. But there is something peculiar about this historical silence. Certain words, certain teachings seem to have been carefully removed from the narratives that have come down to us. Imagine a master walking along dusty trails, surrounded by crowds thirsty for wisdom. His words transformed hearts, healed invisible wounds, and challenged centuries-old power structures. Each teaching carried the weight of eternity. But what if not everything that was said has reached our days? What if there were words so powerful, so revolutionary, that they needed to be silenced? History teaches us that those who hold power over texts also hold power over memory. Over the centuries, manuscripts have been copied, translated, interpreted, and sometimes edited. Not always in bad faith, sometimes out of protective zeal, other times out of political or theological necessity. But the result is the same. Gaps in knowledge, whispers of teachings that never reached our ears. There are ancient reports of followers who preserved words not recorded in official texts, oral traditions that passed from generation to generation, guarded as secret treasures by communities that feared persecution. Some of these traditions mention teachings about the divine nature within the human being, about the power of radical compassion, and about the absolute equality of all souls, concepts that, at certain times, were considered too dangerous to be spread freely. Think back to the first few centuries after the world-changing events. Different groups interpreted the teachings in different ways. Some emphasized inner liberation, others strict adherence to ancient laws. In this melting pot of ideas, decisions were made about which texts would be preserved and which would be left aside. The criteria was not always just authenticity, but also conformity to emerging views. There are those who say that there were complete speeches, profound dialogues about the mysteries of existence, which were never included in official compilations. Conversations about the destiny of the soul, about spiritual learning cycles, about the direct connection between the individual and the divine without the need for intermediaries. Words that gave power to the listeners, not the guardians of institutions. The very nature of oral teaching at that time created vulnerability. Words were passed from mouth to ear, memorized by devout hearts before being recorded on fragile parchment. In this process, what was inconvenient could be forgotten. What was too revolutionary could be softened, and what threatened hierarchies could simply disappear, but the traces remain. In texts discovered in caves and deserts, in fragments of ancient parchments, in traditions preserved by marginalized groups throughout history. These traces invite us to question what was really said, what truths were considered too dangerous to survive intact. This is not a path of accusations or sensational theories. It is a journey of contemplation on how spiritual knowledge has been passed down through the ages, on the forces that have shaped our understanding, and on the mysteries that still wait to be rediscovered. It is a search for completeness amid historical fragmentation. If you feel there is more to be known than what has been handed down to us, if your heart seeks a deeper understanding of the words that changed the world, then this journey is for you. Stick around as we explore the eloquent silences of history and the echoes of teachings that time has tried to erase. To understand what may have been censored, we first need to understand the timeline of events and records. The master who transformed history lived in a time of intense religious and political ferment. The region was a melting pot of cultures, ancient Jewish traditions, Greco-Roman influence, Eastern mysticism, and fervent messianic expectations. The first years after his departure were marked by oral transmission. Immediate followers shared memories, repeated teachings, told stories. It is estimated that the first written texts appeared decades later, when eyewitnesses began to age, and the community realized the need to preserve the words in a more permanent form. From around the 1950s to the 1970s, letters began to circulate between distant communities. These correspondences contained teachings, practical guidance, and interpretations of the events experienced. They were living documents, answering specific questions from specific groups. They were not intended to be complete narratives, but the contextual guidance. The more structured narratives emerged between the 70s and 100s. Different authors in different regions compiled their versions of events and teachings. Each had its own sources, its own emphasis, and its own audiences. The result was a diversity of perspectives. Some shared many elements, others presented unique material. As recorded in John 21:25, there is an explicit recognition that much more was done and said than could be recorded. But there are many other things which Jesus did, and if every one of them were written, I think that not yet the whole world could contain the books that should be written. This statement reveals an awareness of incompleteness in the canonical texts themselves. In the following centuries, particularly between 100 and 400, dozens of texts attributed to close followers proliferated. Some were recognized by certain communities as sacred, others were viewed with suspicion. There were alternative gospels, varied acts of apostles, diverse apocalypses, and collections of sayings that circulated widely. The 4th century marked a crucial turning point. As Christianity became accepted and then official in the Roman Empire, the need for doctrinal uniformity arose. Councils were called, theological debates intensified, and decisions were made about which texts would be considered authentic and authoritative. Certain traditions mention that in this canonization process, texts that emphasized gnosis, direct knowledge of the divine, radical equality or mystical interpretations were progressively marginalized. Not necessarily because of deliberate conspiracy, but because they represented currents that did not align with the emerging orthodoxy. In 367, a letter officially listed 27 books accepted as the New Testament. Other texts, once read and venerated by many, were categorized as apocryphal or heretical. Some were preserved in monastic libraries, others simply disappeared, burned, forgotten, or buried. During the Middle Ages, control over sacred texts intensified. Translations were restricted, interpretations were centralized, and questions were discouraged. Direct access to ancient texts has become the privilege of few scholars. The master's words pass through multiple layers of institutional mediation. Only with modern archaeological discoveries, such as the Nag Hammadi manuscripts in 1945 and the Dead Sea Scrolls between 1946 and 1956, have fragments of alternative traditions come to light. These findings revealed much greater theological diversity than imagined in primitive communities. The timeline shows us a pattern. The further away in time, the more institutional control over the texts. The more centralized the religious power, the narrower the definition of orthodoxy. And the narrower the orthodoxy, the more teachings were left out. This is not necessarily evidence of an evil conspiracy. It is simply the natural functioning of human institutions seeking stability and cohesion. But the inevitable side effect is loss of nuance, of alternative teachings, of words that didn't fit neatly into the theological systems under construction. If you're starting to notice the layers of history between us and the original words, leave your thoughts in the comments. What other historical eras may have influenced what we know today? The mystery begins with a simple but deeply disturbing question. How do we know we have access to everything we have been taught? The honest answer is, we don't know. And this uncertainty opens up a chasm of possibilities that challenges our established understanding of spiritual history. The first clues that something may be missing come from the preserved texts themselves. There are references to lost letters, to teachings given in private, to mysteries revealed only to those closest to us. These are clues left involuntarily, fissures in the official narrative that suggest hidden depth. Consider the mention of teachings given in public parables, but explained in depth only to disciples in private moments. Various narratives indicate that there were two levels of teaching, one for the crowds and one for the inner circle. But the records we have focus predominantly on public education. Where are the details of private conversations? There are those who say that there were teachings about the nature of reality that went far beyond simple metaphors. Concepts about planes of existence, about the continuity of consciousness beyond physical death, about contemplative practices for direct experience of the divine. Themes that appear in fragments, but never fully developed in the canonical texts. Another intriguing aspect is the biographical silences. Decades of the Master's life are simply absent from the narratives. The formative years, the experiences, the ideas that shaped his understanding, the possible contacts with other spiritual traditions of the time, all of this remains shrouded in mystery. What was deliberately omitted? What was simply not recorded? Some ancient accounts mention trips to distant lands, studies with masters from other traditions, periods of intense spiritual preparation. These are speculations, certainly, but they are based on real gaps in the narratives. The silence about these years is not accidental. It is either documentary incompleteness or a deliberate editorial choice. Archaeological discoveries of the 20th century have shed fascinating light on these questions. Texts, such as the Gospel of Thomas, present collections of sayings attributed to the Master that do not appear in any canonical text. Some are variations on known teachings, others are completely new. Its authenticity is debated, but its existence proves that there were parallel traditions circulating in early communities. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, strongly emphasizes the inner search for the divine kingdom. It states that the divine will not come with observable signs, but is already present within and around each person. It is a mystical perspective of personal gnosis, which contrasts with institutional emphases on priestly mediation. Other texts discovered present profound dialogues on cosmology, on the origin of the soul, on the process of spiritual liberation. These are themes that appear in a veiled or metaphorical way in canonical texts, but are treated directly in these alternative writings. Why this difference? Why was one set of texts preserved and another marginalized? The answer may lie in the theological disputes of the first centuries. Different Christian groups had radically different views on the nature of the teacher, on salvation, on the organization of the community. Some emphasized hierarchy and obedience, others emphasized personal experience and equality. The texts reflected these differences. When certain currents prevailed and others were considered heretical, their sacred texts were naturally discarded. Not because they are necessarily false, but because they represent defeated theologies. This is how the history written by the victors works. Alternative voices are silenced, their records are destroyed or buried. But here's the deeper mystery. Even in canonical texts, there are layers of meaning that have been systematically ignored or downplayed over the centuries. Teachings about radical nonviolence, about redistribution of wealth, about dissolving social hierarchies. Themes clearly present, but often softened in institutional practice. Could it be that the most effective censorship was not the physical removal of texts, but the gradual reinterpretation of words that had always been there? The transformation of revolutionary teachings into comfortable dogmas, silencing, not by erasing, but by recontextualizing until the original meaning is lost? This is the mystery that invites us on a deeper journey, not just searching for lost texts, but rediscovering forgotten meanings even in the texts we have. It's looking beyond familiarity and asking what was really being said. Follow this journey with us as we explore the hidden layers of spiritual history and the meanings that await rediscovery. To understand what may have been censored, we need to know the characters at the center of this story. Not just the central master, but those who preserved, interpreted, and sometimes altered his teachings over time. The master himself emerges from the narratives as a paradoxical figure, at once humble and entitled, compassionate and confrontational, mystical and deeply engaged with social issues. He left nothing written personally. His influence depended entirely on the memory and interpretation of others. This created vulnerability inherent in faithfully preserving his words. The closest disciples, fishermen, tax collectors, zealots, were ordinary men, not trained scribes. His loyalty was intense, but his understanding varied. Some captured profound teachings, others struggled with more abstract concepts. This diversity of understanding is reflected in the diversity of texts produced later. Mary Magdalene appears in several narratives as a central figure, present at crucial moments. Some alternative texts present her as a privileged disciple, recipient of special teachings, and a respected leader. There are traditions that suggest tensions between her and other disciples over authority and interpretation. If these tensions existed, they certainly influenced which versions of the teachings prevailed. As recorded in Matthew 13:11, the Master made an explicit distinction between what was shared publicly and what was revealed to the disciples. For to you it has been given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. This establishes that there were levels of teaching and raises the question of how much of the mysteries were actually preserved. Paul of Tarsus never met the Master personally, but he became the main architect of early Christian theology. His letters, written before the Gospels, profoundly shaped how the teachings were interpreted. His emphasis on certain theological aspects, atonement, grace, faith versus works, may have overshadowed other dimensions of the original teachings. There were also groups that never accepted the authority of Paul or other emerging leaders. Communities that maintained practices and teachings transmitted through other channels. The Ebionites, for example, rejected Pauline writings and maintained observance of Jewish laws, claiming fidelity to the original teachings. His texts were lost or destroyed. The Gnostics, a broad term for diverse groups with an emphasis on direct spiritual knowledge, preserved alternative traditions. His texts present the Master as a revealer of cosmic mysteries, as a guide to saving knowledge. They were declared heretics in the 2nd century, and their writings were systematically destroyed. Only in 1945, with the discovery of Nag Hammadi, did some of his works return to light. Ecclesiastical leaders of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, such as Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Origen, played a crucial role in defining orthodoxy. They vigorously fought interpretations that they considered erroneous. His writings attacking heresies are, ironically, our main source of information about these alternative currents. We know these traditions mainly through the eyes of their opponents. Constantine and subsequent Christian emperors had enormous influence over which texts and theologies would prevail. Imperial support for certain currents and persecution of others dramatically accelerated the process of standardization. Texts associated with groups outside of imperial favor simply did not survive. Medieval scribes and copyists working in monastic scriptoria were practical guardians of the texts. Your choices about what to copy, how to translate, which textual variants to preserve, all of this shaped what has come down to us. They were humans with their own beliefs and biases, not neutral reproduction machines. There are also almost forgotten characters, women leaders of the first communities, itinerant prophets, teachers of oral traditions. Their voices appear only obliquely in surviving records. Junia, mentioned briefly as an apostle, how many others like her have been erased from memory? The relationship between all these characters was complex. Cooperation and conflict, unity and fragmentation. Each group claimed authenticity, each leader claimed authority. In this cauldron of competing claims, decisions were made about what was true teaching and what was dangerous deviation. What emerges from this panorama is the understanding that the preservation of teachings has never been a neutral process. It was shaped by personalities, politics, power, and historical circumstances. The words that reached us passed through multiple human filters, some devout and careful, others less scrupulous. This does not invalidate what has been preserved, but it invites us to humility. It reminds us that we are dealing with human transmission of divine experiences and words. The distance between the original event and our access to it is bridged by countless human decisions. If you're discovering layers of complexity you never knew existed, share your thoughts. Which characters from this story would you like to get to know better? At the heart of this historical narrative pulses a deeply spiritual conflict, not just between good and evil in the abstract sense, but between different visions of how humanity should relate to the divine. It is a battle fought not with physical weapons, but with words, interpretations, and control over sacred narratives. The first level of this conflict was theological. Different groups had radically different understandings of the nature of the Master and his teachings. Some saw him primarily as a moral and social teacher, others as a divine avatar, still others as a revealer of Gnostic mysteries. Each interpretation led to very different practices and communities. Those who emphasized hierarchy and institutional authority naturally gravitated toward texts and interpretations that upheld structures of power. Teachings about radical equality, about direct access to the divine without mediators, about the dissolution of hierarchies, these were threatening to the order they sought to establish. On the other hand, groups that emphasized personal mystical experience and direct gnosis valued texts and traditions that highlighted inner knowledge, personal enlightenment, and individual spiritual liberation. For them, institutional structures were secondary or even an obstacle, them to true spirituality. The conflict intensified because it was not merely academic. It had profound practical implications. Who could lead communities? Who had the authority to interpret teachings? How would community resources be managed? What was the role of women? How to relate to political power? There are those who say that certain teachings about the inner power of the individual, about each person's ability to connect directly with the divine, were seen as threatening by those building institutional structures. If each person has direct access to the sacred, why would they need official mediators? Why accept hierarchical authority? Some reports suggest that teachings about spiritual equality between men and women, about female leadership in communities, were progressively minimized as patriarchal structures were consolidated. Texts that preserved these egalitarian traditions were marginalized, while interpretations that upheld gender hierarchies were favored. The conflict also had a political dimension. As Christian communities grew in number and influence, their relationship with the Roman Empire became a critical issue. Teachings about radical nonviolence, about rejection of structures of domination, about absolute loyalty only to the divine realm, all of these were potentially subversive. When Christianity became an imperial religion in the 4th century, this tension reached a critical point. Teachings that were previously countercultural needed to be reconciled with the needs of an empire, how to follow commandments of non-resistance to evil when administering a state, how to practice radical poverty when managing imperial properties. The solution was often to reinterpret radical teachings in terms more palatable to established power. Non-violence became just war theory. Poverty became poverty of spirit compatible with material wealth. Submission to the divine kingdom became submission to God-ordained earthly authorities. But there was resistance. Monastic movements preserved the ideal of radical simplicity. Marginalized groups kept alternative traditions alive. Mystics continued to seek direct experience of the divine despite institutional discouragement. The conflict was never fully resolved, only forced underground. Throughout the Middle Ages, any teaching that challenged ecclesiastical authority was dangerous. Unauthorized translations of scripture, differing interpretations, claims of direct revelation, all of these could result in charges of heresy. Control over sacred texts and their interpretations was a tool of political and religious power. Later reforms and schisms were essentially continuations of this fundamental conflict. There were debates about interpretative authority, about access to original texts, about who had the right to mediate the relationship between human and divine. Each group claimed to restore original teachings, each accused the others of censorship and distortion. The deepest spiritual conflict, however, is perhaps internal to each seeker. It is the tension between accepting received traditions and seeking one's own understanding, between the comfort of institutional certainties and the discomfort of honest questioning, between fear of error and courage to seek personal truth. This conflict is not between bad people deliberately censoring and good people faithfully preserving. It's more subtle and complex. It's about imperfect human beings trying to preserve and transmit experiences of the transcendent, inevitably filtering through their own limitations, fears, and ambitions. Recognizing this is not cynicism. It is realistic humility that allows us to appreciate what has been preserved, while remaining open to possibilities of deeper meanings, forgotten teachings, and dimensions of truth that still await rediscovery. What do you feel when contemplating these historical conflicts? Do they resonate with tensions you observe in contemporary spiritual traditions? Share your thoughts. Each perspective enriches our collective understanding. Now we enter the heart of the mystery. What specific revelations may have been censored, minimized, or forgotten? What teachings do the historical fragments suggest existed but have not fully reached us? One intriguing category is teachings about the divine nature within humanity. There are fragments in alternative texts that present the Master saying that the divine kingdom is within each person, that everyone carries a spark of the divine, that the separation between creator and creation is illusory. These ideas appear in a veiled form in canonical texts, but are developed explicitly in Gnostic writings. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, records sayings such as, "The kingdom is within you and without you. When you know yourselves, you will be known, and you will know that, and you are children of the living Father." It is a teaching that places spiritual power directly in the hands of the individual, not mediated by institutions. It is understandable why such an emphasis would be problematic for developing hierarchical structures. There are also indications of teachings on multiple levels of reality and consciousness. Some ancient texts describe complex cosmologies with different planes of existence, different levels of spiritual knowledge. These are not arbitrary mystical fantasies, but attempts to map the spiritual geography of existence, attempts that were lost when simpler theologies prevailed. As it is written in 1 Corinthians 2:7-10, there is recognition of hidden wisdom revealed only to the spiritually mature. But we speak the wisdom of God, hidden in mystery, which God ordained before the ages for our glory. God revealed them to us by His Spirit. For the Spirit penetrates all things, even the depths of God. This confirms that there were deeper teachings beyond the basics. Another fascinating area is possible teachings on contemplative practices. Scattered references to desert retreats, to nights in prayer, to altered states of consciousness, all of these suggest that there was a practical dimension, specific techniques for achieving direct experience of the divine. But the details of these practices were lost or never recorded. Later, Christian mystical traditions, Orthodox hesychasm, Rhenish mysticism, Carmelite contemplation, developed sophisticated practices of meditation and contemplative prayer. They claimed to be recovering ancient traditions. Were they correct? Were there originally practical teachings on inner transformation that were downplayed in favor of doctrinal emphases? There are those who say that there were explicit teachings about reincarnation or continuity of consciousness through multiple existences. Certain passages in the canonical texts are interpreted by some as veiled hints of this concept. Questions about whether the teacher was Elijah returned, discussions about sins before birth. But if explicit teachings about this existed, they were clearly removed or suppressed. Origen of Alexandria, an influential 3rd century theologian, apparently taught about the pre-existence of souls and final universal restoration. His ideas were later condemned. If one of the greatest early Christian scholars taught such concepts, it is possible that he was drawing on older traditions that were later considered heretical. Teachings about the feminine consecration of the divine also appear in fragments. References to divine wisdom in female form, to the Holy Spirit as a motherly presence, to Mary Magdalene as a beloved disciple, all suggest that more balanced views of gender existed in early communities. But they were progressively masculinized as patriarchy consolidated. Some alternative texts present dialogues between the master and disciples about the origin of evil, the purpose of suffering, the final destiny of creation. These are deep philosophical questions that receive complex and nuanced answers in these writings. In canonical texts, these issues are addressed more symbolically through parables and narratives. The issue of wealth and property is another area where there may have been soft censorship. The canonical texts contain clear teachings about the dangers of wealth, about the impossibility of serving God and money, about the need to share with those in need. But Christian communities quickly settled into property and wealth. Have even more radical teachings about economic redistribution and communitarianism been softened to make them more palatable? The first communities described in the Acts of the Apostles practiced total community of goods. No one considered their property to be exclusively theirs. Everything was shared. This radical economic model quickly disappeared. Have fundamental teachings on spiritual economy been lost or deliberately forgotten because they were incompatible with institutionalized Christianity? There is also mysteries surrounding teachings about healing and spiritual abilities. The texts record multiple cures, exorcisms, even resurrections, but there is little instruction on how disciples could develop these same capabilities. Was there practical transmission of these skills that was not recorded? Specific techniques for laying on of hands, focused prayer, channeling divine energy. Some fragments suggest that there were teachings about the body as a sacred temple, about vital energy circulating through specific centers, about the relationship between physical and spiritual health. These are concepts that appear in contemporary Eastern traditions, but have been minimized in Western Christianity. Did they originally exist? Were lost in the hell processionization and Romanization of the movement? The relationship with nature and the cosmos is another fascinating area. There are passages about watching birds, about lilies of the field, about seeds and harvests, but always in the context of moral teaching, not as reverence for nature itself. Some later Celtic and Franciscan traditions developed spiritualities deeply connected with natural creation. Were they recovering something that was minimized in dominant texts? Teachings about forgiveness and reconciliation feature heavily in the preserved texts. But there are nuances that may have been missed. Was forgiveness conditional or unconditional? Did it require repentance from the offender, or was it inner liberation for the offended? Different texts suggest different emphases. What was the complete original teaching? Eschatology, teachings about end times and final destiny, is an area of enormous variation between texts. Some emphasize imminent judgment, others gradual cosmic transformation, still others universal restoration where everyone eventually returns to the divine. These variations suggest that there was no single clear doctrine, or that different aspects were emphasized by different traditions. What all of these potential revelations have in common is that they represent dimensions of spirituality that have been, to varying degrees, marginalized in the dominant tradition. They have not disappeared completely. They resurface in mystical movements, radical reforms, individual quests, but they have never been fully integrated into the mainstream of Christian thought. The question we are left with is, are we dealing with teachings that actually existed and were suppressed, or with later speculations attributed retroactively? The honest answer is that we can't be completely sure, but historical clues, textual fragments, and logical gaps in narratives suggest that there was much more taught than has been preserved. And perhaps the most important thing is to recognize that even in the texts we have, there are depths that have not yet been explored. Familiar words can contain meanings that we have lost. Teachings we think we understand can reveal additional layers under new eyes. The deepest censorship may not be what has been removed, but what we fail to see in what remains. If you feel that there are truths waiting to be rediscovered, not just in lost texts, but in new understandings of preserved texts, then this journey continues. Stay with us as we explore the consequences of these missed revelations. The consequences of censorship and loss of original teachings have reverberated through the centuries, shaping not just theology, but entire civilizations. What might have been different if the entirety of the teachings had been preserved and practiced? Consider first the impact on individual spirituality. When teachings about direct access to the divine were downplayed in favor of institutional mediation, billions of people grew up believing they needed intermediaries to connect with the sacred. Confidence in one's own spiritual experience was undermined. The power within has been externalized. This externalization created dependence. People looked to priests for absolution, authorities for interpretation, institutions for validation. Not that spiritual guidance is bad. Communities and teachers have immense value. But when it becomes the only way, when personal experience is discouraged or suspect, something fundamental is lost. The marginalization of mystical and contemplative dimensions had a profound effect. Western Christianity has become predominantly doctrinal and ethical, focused on correct beliefs and moral behavior. The experiential dimension, mystical union, contemplative transformation, direct experience of the divine was relegated to monastic elites or was viewed with suspicion. This created an often dry spirituality, focused on external obedience without internal transformation. It took generations to practice religion without vital experience of the sacred. When people do not experience the divine directly, faith becomes a mere intellectual adherence to propositions, easily abandoned when faced with doubts or difficulties. The loss or suppression of teachings about radical equality has had devastating social consequences. If the original teachings truly preached the dissolution of hierarchies and fundamental equality among all people, the Christianization of Roman imperial structures profoundly perverted this message. Instead of egalitarian communities practicing radical sharing, ecclesiastical hierarchies mirroring secular power structures emerged. Instead of women and men sharing leadership as apparently occurred in the first decades, a rigid patriarchy was established that lasted for millennia. Instead of servants becoming free, slavery was theologically justified. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the religious wars, all these atrocities were perpetrated by people who claimed to follow the Prince of Peace. How was this possible? Perhaps because teachings about radical nonviolence, about loving one's enemies, about total rejection of violent coercion, were reinterpreted until they became compatible with holy war and persecution of heretics. The relationship with knowledge and science was also shaped by specific interpretations of texts, When ecclesiastical authority claimed a monopoly on truth, independent investigation became a threat. Galileo's judgment was not an aberration. It was the logical consequence of a system that did not tolerate challenges to its interpretive authority. If original teachings emphasized truth-seeking, honest questioning, and openness to mystery, institutionalization has often created the opposite: dogmatism, intellectual censorship, and fear of questions. How many scientific and philosophical advances have been delayed because they contradicted authoritative interpretations of sacred texts? The issue of wealth and economic justice is particularly painful. The canonical texts contain unambiguous teachings about the dangers of wealth and responsibility for the poor. However, Christian institutions accumulated vast riches while ignoring suffering around them. Ecclesiastical hierarchies lived in luxury while preaching poverty to the laity. Modern prosperity theology takes this to extreme absurdity, teaching that wealth is a sign of divine blessing, a total reversal of teachings about the blessedness of the poor and the curse of the rich. But this perversion has roots in centuries of convenient reinterpretation of uncomfortable words about economic justice. The relationship with other spiritual traditions has also been shaped by exclusivist interpretations. If the Master really taught that there are many mansions in the Father's house, that God is no respecter of persons, this could have founded respectful interreligious dialogue. Instead, doctrines of exclusivity have led to persecution, forced conversions, and the destruction of ancient spiritual traditions. The treatment of minorities, of dissidents, of anyone considered other was often brutal, all justified by selective interpretations of texts. Jews persecuted as deicides, women burned as witches, indigenous people enslaved as soulless pagans. These atrocities were committed by people who claimed to follow teachings of love and compassion. Environmentally, the interpretation of dominion over creation as a license for unlimited exploration has contributed to the current ecological crisis. If teachings about reverence for creation, about the interconnectedness of all life, about the responsibility of guardians and not exploiters had been preserved and emphasized, perhaps our relationship with the planet would be different. Psychologically, doctrines about sin and guilt, when disconnected from teachings about forgiveness and restoration, have created generations plagued by toxic shame. People have grown up believing themselves to be fundamentally evil, unworthy, condemned, rather than loved, divine in essence, called to transformation, but not to self-flagellation. Of course, we cannot attribute all the evils in the world to the censorship of ancient teachings. Human beings are perfectly capable of perverting any system, no matter how pure it is originally. And Christian movements also created hospitals, universities, sublime art, and inspired profound social reforms. But it is legitimate to ask, how much of the beautiful and how much of the horrible in Christian history reflects fidelity to original teachings, and how much reflects distortions accumulated over centuries? If we had access to the entirety of what was taught, would our history have been different? These are not merely academic questions. They are deeply personal for anyone navigating inherited spiritual traditions. How to discern between authentic essence and problematic additions? How can we practice faith informed by ancient wisdom without carrying the baggage of historical distortions? The world we inherit is, in a sense, ruins, not of ancient civilizations, but of unrealized possibilities. It is a world where words of life have been partially preserved, partially lost, partially distorted. Our task is to dig carefully, separate the wheat from the chaff, seek authentic core beneath layers of interpretation. If this exploration is awakening in you a desire to go deeper, to seek more authentic, more complete understanding, then you are not alone. There is a global movement of people rediscovering lost or forgotten dimensions of spirituality. Join this journey of rediscovery. There are moments in history where the obfuscation of truth intensifies, where forces, whether institutional, political, or simply the inertia of forgetfulness, seem to conspire to bury authentic teachings even more deeply. These are periods that we can metaphorically call the rise of the three viyas. The consolidation of ecclesiastical power in the 4th and 5th centuries marked one of these periods. With imperial support, the Christian Church went from a persecuted community to an institution of power. This transformation brought benefits: an end to persecution, resources for charity, expanded cultural influence. But it also brought subtle corruption of the original message, teachings about serving children, about washing each other's feet, about leadership as service. All of this was maintained theoretically, while in practice, rigid hierarchies were established. Bishops dressed in imperial regalia, sat on thrones, demanded reverence. The inversion of values that was central to the teachings was itself inverted. The ecumenical councils of the first centuries established creeds and condemned heresies. This process was necessary for some doctrinal cohesion, but it also silenced alternative voices. Brilliant theologians were declared heretics, not necessarily because they were false, but because they disagreed with emerging consensuses. Their works were burned, their names defamed. As recorded in 2 Corinthians 11:14, there is a warning about deceptive forces. And it is no wonder, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. This passage has historically been used to justify persecution of dissidents, but perhaps it also applies to institutional corruptions that dress up in piety while betraying fundamental principles. The Middle Ages saw intensification of control over knowledge. Texts were copied only in monasteries, read only by clergy, interpreted only by approved authorities. Lay people were kept in deliberate ignorance, dependent on mediators for any access to the sacred. The scriptures were in Latin, a language that most did not understand. This monopolization of knowledge was not accidental, it was a power strategy. People who cannot read sacred texts for themselves, who depend on authorities for interpretation, who believe they have no capacity for spiritual discernment of their own, these people are easily controlled. The Inquisition represented perhaps the darkest point of this rise. Established to combat heresy, it became a machine of terror. People were tortured to confess doctrinal deviations. Books were publicly burned. Alternative spiritual traditions were violently suppressed. All in the name of protecting the truth, but often serving powerful interests. Genuine mystics, people who experienced direct union with the divine, were often suspect. Their experiences, unmediated by institutional authority, were threatening. Joan of Arc heard divine voices and was burned for heresy. Meister Eckhart preached mystical union and was posthumously condemned. The list is long and painful. Financial corruption also marked dark periods. Selling indulgences, simony, nepotism, practices that directly contradicted teachings about simplicity and integrity. When Luther preached his theses, he was reacting not just to theological errors, but to systemic moral corruption. The Reformation brought necessary renewal, but also violent fragmentation. Religious wars devastated Europe. Catholics and Protestants killed each other, each side claiming allegiance to the teachings of the Prince of Peace. The irony was grotesque, but it seemed invisible to those involved. Colonialism took this darkness to new continents. Missionaries arrived with conquerors, preaching love while civilizations were destroyed. Indigenous people were forced to convert, their spiritual traditions demonized, their lands stolen, all justified by the salvation of pagan souls. The Spanish Inquisition in America was particularly brutal. Mayan codices were burned en masse, erasing knowledge accumulated over millennia. Indigenous shamans were persecuted. Native spiritualities were labeled as demonic. The justification was always the same: to protect souls from eternal perdition. African slavery was theologically justified. Biblical pastures were twisted to argue that certain people were cursed to servitude. Human beings were treated as property, families were separated, cultures were destroyed, and Christian institutions were complicit, if not leaders, in this atrocity. In the 20th century, new forms of obfuscation emerged. Televangelism transformed spiritual messages into consumer products. Megachurches have focused on entertainment rather than transformation. Prosperity theology completely reversed teachings about wealth, promising material blessing as a reward for faith. Politicization of faith, especially in some regions, has turned spiritual teachings into party platforms. Alliances between religious and political power created situations where Jesus would be recognizable more in the marginalized protesting than in the institutions that claim to represent him. Systemic sexual abuse in religious institutions, covered up for decades, represents perhaps the deepest betrayal. Those who were supposed to be spiritual guardians betrayed the most vulnerable, and institutional systems protected perpetrators rather than victims, prioritizing reputation over justice. In each of these periods and events, we can trace a connection with the loss or distortion of original teachings. When emphasis on inner spiritual power was minimized, external authority was absolutized. When teachings on nonviolence were reinterpreted, holy wars became possible. When economic justice was spiritualized, material exploitation was tolerated. This is not a story of deliberate conspiracy by evil villains. It is a more tragic and common story of imperfect human beings, even well-intentioned ones, gradually corrupting messages that were supposed to transform. It is a pattern that repeats itself because we do not learn lessons from previous cycles. Darkness ascends not primarily through the action of malignant external forces, but through inner forgetfulness. When we stop questioning, when we accept interpretations without examination, when we value conformity over truth, that's when the light gradually goes out. But there is hope. Every rise of darkness contains seeds of renewal. People who preserved wisdom in difficult times, texts that survived in hiding, truths that insist on emerging no matter how many times they are buried. Light can be dimmed but not extinguished. Share your reflections. Do you recognize patterns from these historical periods in contemporary dynamics? What can be done to avoid repeating these mistakes? Even in the darkest periods, there have always been those who resisted, not with violence, but with fidelity to the authentic essence of the teachings. This resistance of light is as important as the rise of darkness, as it represents ongoing hope for renewal and rediscovery. The Desert Fathers in the early centuries represented a form of resistance. As Christianity became institutionalized in cities, they sought out deserts for radical practices of contemplation and simplicity. They rejected wealth and power, focusing on inner transformation. His sayings preserved practical wisdom about authentic spiritual living. These hermits and early monastic communities kept alive contemplative practices that might have been lost completely in the Christianization of the empire. Their direct mystical experiences of the divine preserved the experiential dimension of faith, in contrast to the growing dogmatism of official institutions. Subsequent monastic movements, Benedictines, Cistercians, Carthusians, continued this tradition. Within institutional structures, they created spaces for deep spiritual practice. They copied and preserved ancient manuscripts. They maintained traditions of hospitality and service. They were not perfect, but they represented a current of authenticity. Medieval mystics were particularly important. Hildegard of Bingen, Francis of Assisi, Mechtilde of Magdeburg, Juliana of Norwich, Master Eckhart. These and other figures experienced direct union with the divine and expressed their visions despite sometimes facing official suspicion or condemnation. Francis of Assisi especially embodied a radical return to teachings about poverty, simplicity, and love of creation. His life was a silent protest against the ecclesiastical corruption of his time. He did not attack the institution directly, but he lived an alternative so bright that it exposed the surrounding darkness by contrast. Traditions of beguines, lay women who lived in a spiritual community without formal vows, represented resistance to female marginalization. They were often persecuted because they represented female spiritual autonomy outside of patriarchal control. But they persisted, preserving spaces for feminine spiritual search. The Reformation, despite its violence, represented crucial resistance. Translation of scriptures into vernacular languages returned sacred texts to the people. Emphasis on priesthood of all believers challenged rigid hierarchies. Not everything in the Reformation was light. There was intolerance and violence, but there was also a genuine impulse to return to sources. Anabaptists and other radical Reformation groups took principles even further. They practiced non-violence, sharing of goods, separation of church and state. They were persecuted by both Catholics and established Protestants, but they preserved a vision of a Christian community that was closer to original ideals. Quakers, emerging in the 17th century, emphasized inner light in every person, radical equality, absolute pacifism. They were pioneers in abolitionism, women's rights, and social justice. Their insistence on direct experience of the divine and rejection of formal sacramentalism connected them to ancient mystical currents. Pietism, Methodism, and other movements of spiritual renewal in the 17th and 18th centuries represent resistance to dead orthodoxies. They emphasized personal experience of conversion, holiness of life, and social service. They created hospitals, schools, and charitable missions. They rekindled the experiential and practical dimension of faith. In the 20th century, liberation theology in Latin America represented a radical return to teachings about justice for the poor. Facing oppressive regimes and conservative ecclesiastical hierarchies, liberation theologians insisted that gospel means material good news for the oppressed, not just future spiritual salvation. Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King Jr., Oscar Romero, Mother Teresa, 20th century figures who embodied non-violent resistance and radical service to the marginalized. Each, in their own way, called Christian communities back to often forgotten foundational teachings about peace, justice, and compassion. Contemporary contemplative movements focus on prayer, Christian meditation, new monasticity, represent rediscovery of mystical and contemplative dimensions. They draw on ancient traditions while making them accessible to modern people. They resist the reduction of faith to dogmas or moralism. Critical scholars who examine texts with academic honesty are also part of this resistance. By revealing historical processes of scriptural formation, by discovering alternative texts, by contextualizing teachings, they help us see beyond fossilized dogmas to richer and more complex realities. Interfaith communities that dialogue respectfully, recognizing truth in multiple traditions, resist exclusivism that has caused so much suffering. They embody the possibility of deep faith without the need to condemn other spiritual paths. Contemporary social justice movements, environmentalism, LGBTQ+ rights, racial justice, feminism, are often led by or include people of faith who see a connection between spiritual teachings and social justice. They resist the privatization of faith, insisting that authentic spirituality has implications for how we treat all of creation. Anonymous individuals who question honestly, who seek spiritual authenticity, who refuse to accept easy answers, each is part of this resistance. We don't need to be saints or martyrs. Simply committing ourselves to truth, compassion, and sincere pursuit is an act of resistance in a world of superficial conformity. The light resistance is not dramatic or violent. It is often quiet, persistent, grounded in daily practices of prayer, study, service, and community. It's choosing integrity when compromise would be easier. It's keeping the flame of authenticity alive when forces around you push for conformity. And crucially, this resistance recognizes that recovering lost teachings is not just a historical exercise. It is a living search for truth that transforms. It is not enough to know intellectually what may have been censored. We must embody rediscovered principles in our lives. This resistance continues today in every person who refuses to accept impoverished versions of the spiritual heritage. In every community that practices radical equality, deep contemplation, and compassionate service. In every heart that seeks direct experience of the sacred instead of accepting inadequate mediations. You are part of this resistance simply by being here, seeking deeper understanding. Stay with us as we explore what this journey of rediscovery could mean. We have reached the moment of greatest revelation, not because we have all the answers, but because we can finally see the question in its entirety. What is really at stake in the search for the censored words of Jesus is not just historical curiosity, but the possibility of present and future transformation. The prophetic climax of this journey is recognizing that the deepest censorship was not the physical removal of texts, significant as that was. It was the obscuring of a fundamental truth, that every human being carries within them the divine spark, that the kingdom of God is within and among us, that authentic spiritual transformation is possible for everyone without the need for human intermediaries. This truth appears even in canonical texts, but it has been systematically minimized. When the Master said that his followers would do even greater works than his, he was conferring spiritual authority directly on them. When he taught that the kingdom is within you, he was locating the sacred not in temples or institutions, but in human consciousness. As recorded in John 14:12, there is an extraordinary promise that is rarely taken seriously. He who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and greater works, because I go to the Father. If this were taken literally, each person would be seen as possessing immense divine potential, a dangerous prospect for hierarchies that depend on maintaining such centralized power. The PR dimension of ethics is not just about predicting the future, but about revealing present truths that have been obscured. And the revealed truth is this: religious systems often betray the very thing they claim to preserve, not necessarily due to bad faith, but due to the inevitable dynamics of institutionalization that transform living experience into dead doctrine. There is a prophetic pattern throughout history. Spiritual movement arises from authentic experience, transforms lives, grows rapidly. Then it is institutionalized for preservation and organization. Gradually, preservation becomes more important than vitality. Orthodoxy becomes more valued than experience. Control replaces freedom, and the cycle needs to be broken by new renewal. Certain traditions mention that this pattern will repeat itself until humanity learns a fundamental lesson. Institutions are servants, not masters. Texts are maps, not territories. Doctrines are fingers pointing to the moon, not the moon itself. As long as we confuse means with ends, we will continue to betray truths that we seek to preserve. The prophetic climax also includes recognition that we are in a moment of rediscovery. More ancient texts have been discovered in the last century than in the entire previous millennium. Modern scholarly methods reveal layers of textual history invisible to previous generations. Interfaith dialogue opens up possibilities for comparative understanding. Simultaneously, there is growing spiritual hunger. People leave traditional religious institutions in unprecedented numbers, not necessarily because they reject spirituality, but because they seek authenticity that they cannot find in established structures. There is a search for direct experience, for transformative practices, for genuine communities. This combination, expanded access to historical knowledge and hunger for spiritual authenticity, creates unique possibility. We can recover lost dimensions of the original teachings, not just as an academic exercise, but as living resources for personal and social transformation. The prophetic vision is of renewed Christianity, or rather, of spirituality inspired by the original teachings that transcends institutional limits of historic Christianity. A spirituality that integrates mystical contemplation and compassionate action, personal experience and supportive community, theological depth and practical simplicity, reverence for tradition and openness to evolution, fidelity to the essential core and freedom from fossilized forms. This does not mean creating a new religion or rejecting existing traditions. It means digging beneath layers of interpretation to find the original source. It means honoring the wisdom of ancestors while recognizing inevitable human limitations in its preservation. It means allowing ancient teachings to speak again with original power. Perhaps the most prophetic aspect is the recognition that censored words are not just in lost texts of the past. They are being censored now, in our time. Every time we choose conformity over authenticity, we are censoring truth. Every time we accept convenient interpretations rather than confront ethical challenges, we are erasing words. The censored words are those that call us to radical transformation, renouncing selfishness, practicing universal compassion, committing to justice even when costly, seeking mystical union even when terrifying. These words are censored not primarily by external authorities, but by our own inner resistance. The prophetic vision includes collapse of systems that cannot be reformed because they are fundamentally contrary to the teachings they claim to represent. Not collapse through violent destruction, but through people simply failing to sustain the unsustainable. When critical masses of individuals awaken to authenticity, structures based on control and mediation lose power. There is also a prophetic warning: rediscovery can be misused. Just as original teachings have been corrupted in the past, attempts at recovery can be equally corrupted. New era can become commercialization of the sacred. Mysticism can become narcissistic escapism. Emphasis on personal experience can fragment into individualism without community. The key is discernment, ability to recognize authenticity from counterfeit, essence from accretion, liberation from new form of bondage. And this discernment is not primarily intellectual, but spiritual. It comes from contemplative practice, from humility, from openness to the spirit that continues to guide honest seekers. The prophetic climax is also personal. It's not enough to know intellectually what may have been censored. The question is, how does this rediscovery transform my life? How do teachings about inner power change my dependence on external validation? How do revelations about radical equality change my relationships? Like wisdom, does contemplation deepen my spiritual practice? If rediscovery does not lead to transformation, it becomes just more useless knowledge, more intellectual baggage. The goal has never been to accumulate information about the past, but to allow ancient wisdom to awaken us in the present to future possibilities. And there is a crucial collective dimension. Individual rediscovery must generate renewed communities, not new institutions that will repeat old mistakes, but fluid networks of people committed to authentic practice. Communities that value experience over doctrine, transformation over conformity, service over status. The final prophetic vision is of humanity awakening to its deep spiritual nature, not all at once. It's never all at once, but enough critical masses that cultural patterns change, that oppressive systems lose legitimacy, that new possibilities emerge. This is not naive utopianism. It is recognition of historical patterns where impossible changes suddenly become inevitable. Slavery was considered a permanent institution until abolitionists became undeniable. Colonialism seemed eternal until liberation movements overthrew it. Fundamental change always seems impossible until the moment it occurs. Recovery of censored words is part of this broader process of liberation. Liberation from dogmas that imprison, from hierarchies that oppress, from interpretations that impoverish, liberation into deeper truth, into richer experience, into fuller humanity. If you feel called to be part of this rediscovery and renewal, know that you are not alone. Throughout history, in every generation, there have been those who have kept the flame alive. You are part of an ancient lineage of seekers, reformers, mystics, and prophets. The same light that guided you is available to you. This is not a conclusion, but an invitation. Invitation to examine your own spiritual life honestly, to question what we were taught to accept without thinking, to seek direct experience of the divine, to live authentic teachings even when difficult, to be part of the ongoing resistance of light. If this climax of revelation resonates in your heart, consider what it means for your personal journey. Subscribing to our channel is more than just following content. It's a declaration of intent to keep searching, to stay awake, to not accept easy answers when deeper truths await. The consequences of everything we explore do not just lie in the past or some distant future. They manifest themselves now, in our lives, in our choices, in the way we relate to spiritual traditions and to each other. The first consequence is awakening. Once you see that sacred texts have history, that they have passed through human hands, that they have been edited and interpreted through lenses of power and politics, you can no longer read them naively. It is not a loss of faith, but its maturation. It is transition from childish belief to adult confidence that can accommodate complexity. This awakening can be disorienting. Many grow up with absolute certainty about scriptures, doctrines, and religious authorities. Discovering that everything is more complex, more ambiguous, more human than you were taught can feel like losing solid ground, but it is necessary. Truth that cannot bear questioning is not truth deep enough. Second consequence is responsibility. If we can no longer delegate spiritual discernment entirely to external authorities, then each person must develop their own capacity for judgment. This does not mean rejecting guidance. Communities and wise teachers have immense value, but it means final verdict on what we accept as truth lies in our own enlightened consciousness. This responsibility is scary. It is easier to follow authorities without questioning, accept traditions without examining, conform without thinking. But spiritual authenticity requires courage to think for yourself, to confront inconvenient truths, to live with the tension of not having all the answers. Third consequence is freedom, but freedom with weight. Freedom from dogmas that do not resonate, from practices that do not transform, from interpretations that oppress. But also the burden of choosing wisely, of not using freedom as a license for self-indulgence, of building intentional spiritual practice rather than simply reacting against tradition. Many, when they discover problems in religious traditions, simply abandon them altogether. It's an understandable reaction, but they often throw out the baby with the bathwater. They reject not only distortions, but also authentic wisdom preserved in traditions. The challenge is to discern, separate, integrate the valuable while releasing the harmful. Fourth consequence is transformed relationship with sacred texts. Instead of reading scriptures as inerrant divine dictations, we read them as human records of encounters with the divine. We value them not because they are perfect, but because they preserve testimony of authentic spiritual journeys. We learn to listen through words to the experiences that generated them. This opens up texts in new ways. Parables reveal unsuspected depths, Narratives show layers of meaning. Even problematic passages teach, not as models to imitate, but as examples of how even sacred texts reflect the human limitations of their authors and editors. Fifth consequence is appreciation for the journey over destination. If there are no absolute certainties accessible, then spiritual life becomes a continuous journey of discovery rather than adherence to fixed truths. This may seem less safe, but it is much more alive. It is a spirituality of exploration, not of fortification. Sixth consequence is humility, recognition that no one has a monopoly on truth. If historic Christianity distorted original teachings, probably all traditions have similar distortions. This does not lead to relativism where everything is equally true, but to the recognition that truth is greater than any individual tradition, deeper than any human formulation. This humility opens doors for genuine interfaith dialogue. Not superficial dialogue of mutual courtesy, but deep exploration of how different traditions capture complementary aspects of spiritual reality. One can be deeply rooted in one tradition while recognizing wisdom in others. Seventh consequence is renewed commitment to practice. Historical knowledge about texts and traditions is valuable but insufficient. What matters is transformation. Meditation, contemplative prayer, compassionate service, authentic community. Practices that truly shift consciousness are essential. Without them, everything is just intellectual speculation. Eighth consequence is social engagement. If authentic teachings include justice for the oppressed, care for creation, dissolution of oppressive hierarchies, then spirituality cannot be deprived. It has implications for how we live in society, how we vote, how we consume, how we treat marginalized people. Many prefer privatized spirituality, focused exclusively on personal inner peace, but that is a luxury for the privileged. Original teachings were deeply social. Good news for the poor, liberation for captives, sight for the blind, freedom for the oppressed. Rediscovering this means rediscovering the prophetic dimension of faith. Ninth consequence is creative tension. Living between what has been traditionally taught and what we discover through honest study creates tension. We cannot simply reject traditions that formed us, but we also cannot ignore truths that we have discovered. Learning to live in this tension without resolving it artificially is spiritual art. Tenth consequence is hope. Not naive optimism, but reasoned hope. If distortions were created by humans, they can be corrected by humans. If truths have been obscured, they can be rediscovered. If traditions have betrayed ideals, they can be renewed. Not easily, not quickly, but possibly. Finally, there is transmission consequence. Rediscovering authentic teachings is not just for personal benefit. It is to share, to pass on, to contribute to the current of renewal that flows through generations. Everyone who awakens can help others to awaken. Everyone who finds freedom can help others to free themselves. This broadcast is not aggressive proselytizing. It's simply living so authentically, so transformed, that others naturally ask, "What's different about you?" and then share not ready-made answers, but an invitation to your own journey of discovery. The final consequences are, therefore, deeply personal, but never merely individual. They affect how we live alone, but also how we live together. They transform individual consciousness, but through this they contribute to collective transformation. What will you do with what you discover on this journey? How will you allow this knowledge to transform not just your thinking, but your life? These are questions that only you can answer. But reflecting on them, talking about them, sharing them with others, this enriches the journey for everyone. Leave in the comments how this exploration is impacting your understanding and practice. Your reflections can light the way for others on the same journey. We have reached the end of this journey, but in some ways, we are only at the beginning. What we explore are not mere historical curiosities or abstract academic theories. They are living questions that touch the heart of how we understand spirituality, truth, and our own identity as meaning-seeking beings. The censored words of Jesus, whether literally removed texts or systematically downplayed teaching dimensions, represent something greater than historical gaps. Rich. They represent unrealized possibilities, spiritual potentials still waiting to be actualized, depths still waiting to be explored. In Luke 8:17 we find promise and warning, for there is nothing hidden that will not be revealed, nor hidden that will not be known and come to light. This passage suggests that obscured truths will inevitably emerge. Our time may be a time of such an emergency, a time when long-kept secrets come to the surface. But revealing hidden truths is not an end in itself. It's a call for response. Knowledge that does not transform is dead weight. Wisdom that is not lived is a betrayal of wisdom. The question has never been merely what was censored, but what we will do with rediscovery. This is a time of choice. We can return to comfortable certainties, ignore complexities we have discovered, continue living superficial and unexamined spirituality. This is always an option. Many choose it because the alternative is very demanding. Or we can embrace the call to authenticity, however uncomfortable, however challenging, however disorienting it may initially be. We can commit to a journey of personal rediscovery, not accepting ready-made answers, but seeking truth through practice, study, and direct experience. The prophetic tradition has always been about seeing what is hidden and speaking what needs to be said, even when inconvenient. True prophets are not just those who predict the future, but those who reveal present truths that society prefers to ignore. In this sense, every honest seeker participates in the prophetic vocation. The specific calling that emerges from this exploration is multifaceted. First, it is called for serious study. We cannot base spirituality on historical ignorance. We need to know how texts were formed, how traditions evolved, what forces shaped what we receive. This does not destroy faith, it deepens and matures. Second, it is called to contemplative practice. Intellectual knowledge is insufficient. We need direct experience of the divine, real inner transformation. Meditation, contemplative prayer, silence, practices that open us to deeper dimensions of reality. Third, it is a call to authentic community. Spiritual journey cannot be just individual. We need companions, dialogue, mutual support. But communities that value authenticity over conformity, questioning over easy certainties, transformation over institutional maintenance. Fourth, it is called to righteousness. If authentic teachings include radical concern for the marginalized, then rediscovering them means renewing commitment to social justice. Spirituality disconnected from ethics is narcissism in disguise. Fifth, it is called to humility. The more we learn, the more we realize how much we don't know. The more we practice, the more we recognize how far we are from ideals. Humility is not self-deprecation, but honest realism about the human condition. Sixth, it is called to hope. Despite historical distortions, despite institutional betrayals, despite complexities and ambiguities, fundamental truth remains accessible. The divine continues to reveal itself to sincere hearts. Transformation remains possible. We deeply thank you for your journey with us so far, for your openness to question, to contemplate, to explore beyond comfortable boundaries. Each person who seriously engages with these issues contributes to the current of renewal that flows through the ages. This is not dismissal, but transition. What we share here is just an introduction to an exploration that can last a lifetime. There are more layers to discover, more depths to plumb, more mysteries to contemplate. Each answer generates new questions. Each discovery opens new horizons. There are even deeper truths awaiting those willing to keep searching. There are revelations that cannot simply be told, but must be experienced personally. There are dimensions of spiritual reality that words only hint at, but never fully capture. The journey continues beyond this point, delving into even more mysterious and transformative territories. There are paths that few take, not because they are secret, but because they require commitment that few are willing to make. There is wisdom that only reveals itself to those who demonstrate seriousness of purpose through consistent practice. If you feel called to delve even deeper, to explore dimensions that we have only touched on here, know that the door is open. It is not a path to easy answers or comfortable certainties. It is a path of genuine transformation, of discoveries that challenge everything we think we know. The invitation remains. Keep seeking, keep questioning, keep practicing. Connect with others who share this journey. Don't accept superficial substitutes when authentic depth is available. Don't be satisfied with crumbs when full feast awaits. Join us as we continue to explore these mysteries that span time and space, that connect past, present, and future in a tapestry of spiritual meaning. There is much more to be discovered. The adventure has just begun. May the light that has guided seekers through the centuries continue to illuminate your path. May the truth that cannot be suppressed continue to emerge in your consciousness. May the transformation that is the central promise of all authentic teachings become a living reality in your experience. Until we meet again in the continuation of this never-ending journey.